The biscuit hit the wooden boards of the porch steps with a soft thud, and Sheriff Zane Jarrett looked up from the tin cup he had been staring into for the past half hour to find Elara Keene standing over him with fury in her eyes. Not the warm, soft Elara who moved through the golden light of her bakery like she belonged to it. Not the woman he had watched from this very step for 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. This Elara was trembling, and her flour-dusted hands were balled into fists at her sides, and there were tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "I know who you are," she said, her voice low and shaking like the ground before a stampede. "I know what you did in Caldwell." The whole of Hatchet Creek seemed to go quiet around them. The blacksmith's hammer stopped ringing. The wagon that had been rolling down Main Street seemed to slow. Even the wind off the flats died, as if the world itself wanted to hear what came next. Zane set down his tin cup with a steadiness that cost him everything he had. "Then you know," he said, "why I can't leave. You let him hang." The words came out cracked and terrible. "You let my brother hang for something he didn't do, and you sat there and you watched it, and you never said a word." Zane stood then. All 6 feet and 2 inches of him rose slowly from the step, and he turned to face her fully, and she did not back away. She was small against him, had always seemed small from a distance, this woman who built her days out of flour and heat and quiet industry. But right now there was nothing small about her. Right now she looked like the most dangerous thing in Hatchet Creek. "Elara, don't." Her voice split on the single syllable. "Don't say my name like that. Don't you dare say my name like you know me." He wanted to tell her that he had known her, that he had watched her light the lamps in her bakery before the sun came up every morning, and that the sight of that warm glow through the window glass had been the only thing in 4 months that had made him believe there was still something in this world worth protecting. He wanted to tell her that he had sat on these steps every single morning not because he had nowhere else to go, though God knew that was true, but because being near her, even separated by a wall and a window and all his unspoken guilt, had kept him from riding out of Hatchet Creek and not stopping until the land ran out. He didn't say any of that, because none of it was the point. The point was her brother. The point was what had happened in Caldwell in the autumn of 1882, when Zane Jarrett had made the worst choice of his life and a young man had died for it. "I need to explain something to you," he said. "I don't want your explanation." "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm going to give it to you anyway." It had begun in the spring of 1883, which was to say it had begun the way most things in the Wild West began. Not with a dramatic entry, but with exhaustion. Zane Jarrett had ridden into Hatchet Creek, New Mexico Territory, on a gray horse named Rook, with a letter of appointment from the territorial governor folded in his breast pocket and nothing else of value on his person. He was 31 years old. He had been a lawman for 9 years, first as a deputy in Dodge City, then as a deputy marshal out of Santa Fe, and most recently and most catastrophically as the acting sheriff of Caldwell, Kansas, a post he had held for 14 months before everything came apart. Hatchet Creek was not an important town. It sat on the edge of nowhere, a handful of buildings pressed against the base of a red rock mesa, surrounded by flat, dry land that shimmered in the heat and produced more dust than it did anything else. The population was somewhere between 300 and 400, depending on who was counting, and whether they were counting the homesteaders who came and went, and the Mexican families who had been there longer than anyone, and were seldom counted regardless. The town had a general store run by a man named Chester Vance, who was 60 years old and suspicious of everyone. It had a saloon called the Copperhead, which served whiskey that tasted like it had been filtered through a boot. It had a livery stable, a small church, a telegraph office that worked when the wire held, and a bakery. The bakery was the first thing Zane noticed when he rode down Main Street, because it was the only building in Hatchet Creek with flower boxes in the window. Red and yellow wildflowers in painted wooden boxes, impossibly cheerful against the sun-bleached facade. A hand-lettered sign above the door read Keene's Bakery in careful, steady letters. He did not go in that first day. He went to the sheriff's office, which was a single room with a desk and a gun rack and a cell in the back, and he sat down in the chair that had belonged to the previous sheriff, a man named Dobbins who had died of a heart seizure 6 weeks prior. And he looked at the four walls and the peeling plaster and the empty wanted posters, and he thought about Caldwell. He thought about Thomas Keene. Thomas Keene had been 23 years old and had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in September of 1882 looking for work. He was from a small town in New Mexico Territory, which Zane had not thought anything of at the time. He was a lean, dark-haired young man with an easy manner and a laugh that came out of nowhere and filled whatever room he was in. He had found work at the stockyards, and he had stayed at a boarding house on the south side of town, and he had, by all accounts, minded his own business. Then a man named Franklin Cree had accused him of stealing. Cree was a cattle broker with money and connections, and a voice that could fill a courtroom, and what he said carried weight that the quiet testimony of a young man from New Mexico could not counterbalance. The stolen item, a silver pocket watch, had been found in Thomas Keene's room at the boarding house, and the judge had been appointed by a friend of Franklin Cree's, and the jury had been selected from men who owed Franklin Cree favors, and Thomas Keene had been convicted in 2 days. Zane had known. That was the truth of it, the dark and immovable truth. He had known because he had done his own investigating that Franklin Cree had planted that watch. He had found a witness, a woman named Dolores who worked at the boarding house, who had seen Cree's man go into Thomas Keene's room. He had the evidence. He had built the case. And then Franklin Cree had come to his office and had laid a different kind of case on his desk. Evidence of things that Zane had done. A death in Dodge City, 4 years prior, that had been ruled accidental but hadn't been. A man who had come at Zane with a knife in a dark alley and had ended up face down in the dirt, which should have been fine. Except the man had turned out to be the son of a judge, and the shooting had been just close enough to reckless that it could be made to look like murder if someone with resources wanted to make it look that way. Cree wanted the Keene case to go away. He wanted Dolores gone and her testimony buried. And he had the leverage to make Zane comply, or so he'd claimed, and Zane had believed him. And Thomas Keene had hanged on a Tuesday morning in October while Zane Jarrett sat in his office with the door closed and tried to tell himself he'd had no choice. He had resigned 2 days later. He had ridden south because he couldn't make himself go anywhere with purpose. He had ended up in Santa Fe, and the territorial governor, who did not know about Caldwell and knew only that Zane's record before Caldwell had been exceptional, had offered him a posting in Hatchet Creek, and Zane had taken it because he had needed something to do with his hands. He had not known when he accepted the posting that Thomas Keene had had a sister. He had not known her name. He had not known she ran a bakery in the very town where he was being sent to keep the peace. He found out about Elara Keene on his second morning in Hatchet Creek, when he walked past the bakery and saw her name above the door and felt the world shift under his feet in a way that had nothing to do with the ground. He kept walking. He went to the general store and asked Chester Vance about the bakery and its owner, keeping his voice easy and his questions casual. And Chester Vance, who was suspicious of everyone, nevertheless had opinions about everything and shared them freely when given the opportunity. The baker, Chester said, was a young woman named Elara Keene. She had come to Hatchet Creek about a year prior. She had come alone. She had set up her bakery in a building that had been abandoned and had fixed it up herself with money she had earned doing laundry and cleaning for the ranch families outside of town. She made biscuits, Chester said, that were worth the walk. She was also, Chester added, as private as they came. Didn't socialize. Didn't come to the church socials. Didn't take meals at the Copperhead like most of the single women in town did when they could afford it. She opened her shop at 5 in the morning and she closed it at noon, and she went back to the small apartment above the bakery, and she stayed there. Chester did not say, but Zane understood from the particular way Chester's voice flattened when he described her, that people in Hatchet Creek thought Elara Keene's solitude was strange or unfriendly. Zane understood it differently. He understood it as grief with nowhere to go. He stayed away from the bakery for the first week. He told himself this was professional discipline. He was new to the town. He needed to establish his authority, to learn the landscape of the place, to understand where the trouble was likely to come from and how to head it off. There were things in Hatchet Creek that required attention. A cattle rancher named Hollis Drummond had been pushing against the property lines of the smaller homesteaders for 2 seasons, and the tension had reached a point where someone was going to draw iron before long. There was a pair of brothers who came through town once a month from somewhere to the south, and who always drank too much at the Copperhead and always broke something on their way out. There was a question of water rights along the eastern creek bed that had 3 families barely speaking to one another. Zane worked. He was good at working. It was the one thing he had always been able to do without the weight of Caldwell pressing too hard against his ribs. But every morning when he walked from his office to wherever the day was taking him, he walked down Main Street and he walked past the bakery, and he could smell the bread and the biscuits from 20 feet away, and he could see the light in the window even before the sun was fully up, and he found himself slowing. He didn't know what he was doing exactly the first morning he sat down on the steps. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his arrival. He had been up since 3 in the morning because he had heard a commotion near the livery stable that had turned out to be 2 cats and a raccoon engaged in a disagreement. And after that, he couldn't sleep, and he had made himself coffee on the small iron stove in his office and had walked outside because the inside of the office felt too small. He ended up in front of the bakery. The lights were on inside. The smell of something warm and yeasty and absolutely incompatible with his current mood drifted under the door, and Zane sat down on the top step because his legs had simply decided they were done walking, and he held his tin cup of terrible coffee and looked at the dark sky beginning to blue at the eastern edge, and he didn't think about anything in particular. He was still there when Elara Keene opened the bakery at 5. The door swung open, and she came out to turn the sign in the window from closed to open, and she almost stepped on him, and she pulled up short and looked down at him with dark eyes that were wide with surprise and not yet guarded. She was younger than he had expected. 26, he would later learn, though she had something in her face that made her seem older and younger at the same time, old in the eyes, young in the set of her mouth, which was not yet completely hardened. Her hair was dark and pulled back under a cloth cap, and there was flour on her collar and on the back of her hands. "Sheriff," she said. Her voice was careful. "Madam." He stood because it was the right thing to do. "I apologize. I didn't mean to be in your way." "You're on my steps," she said. Not accusatory, just noting the fact. "I am." He stepped down to the street. "I'll move along." She looked at him for another moment. Not the kind of looking that was hostile, but the kind that was measuring, the kind of look a woman who had learned to be careful gave to a thing she hadn't decided about yet. And then she went back inside and the door closed behind her. Zane stood in the street for a moment, holding his cold coffee, and felt something strange and unfamiliar turn over in his chest. Something that was not quite shame, though it was related to shame. Something that was more like the awareness of what he had taken from her without ever having meant to, and the particular helplessness of debts that could never be repaid. He walked away. He did not look back, but the next morning he was there again, and the morning after that. He didn't plan it. He didn't examine the impulse too closely. He simply found himself, every morning before the sun came up, sitting on the steps of Keene's bakery with his tin cup, watching the sky change color, and finding in the warmth that came under the door and the sounds of someone moving and working inside a kind of companionship that asked nothing of him. After the first week of this, Elara stopped being startled to find him there. She would open the door and step around him and turn the sign and go back inside without a word, and Zane would remain on the steps until the town started to wake up and he needed to be about his business. After the second week, she began to acknowledge him. Not much. A nod, occasionally a word. Cold this morning, or looks like wind coming, or once, memorably, you have nowhere else to be. To which Zane had said, after a moment of honest reflection, "No, madam, I don't believe I do." And she had looked at him for a long moment before going back inside. He learned things about her from these brief exchanges and from the small details of her mornings. She worked harder than any person he had ever observed. She was in her bakery by 4 in the morning at the latest, and sometimes the light was on when he arrived at 3:30. She sold out most mornings by 9 or 10, which meant people came from the ranches and homesteads outside of town, not just the town itself. She managed every part of the operation alone: the baking, the selling, the cleaning, the ordering of supplies. When Chester Vance's freight connection came through, she did not smile often. When she did, it was brief and slightly surprised, as if the smile had caught her off guard, as if she had not been expecting to find anything amusing or warm. It was the smile of someone who had been through something that had changed the landscape of her face, who was still relearning how to inhabit it. Zane knew that smile. He had seen it in mirrors for the better part of a year. He was careful not to become a problem for her. He did not ask questions about her life or her past. He did not linger beyond his customary half hour. He did not, under any circumstances, try to make her like him, not because he didn't want her to, but because it seemed like a thing he had no right to want. The town noticed, of course. Hatchet Creek was small enough that people noticed everything. He heard comments from time to time, from Chester Vance's wife Mildred, from the men at the Copperhead, from the woman who ran the telegraph office, a sharp-eyed person named Agnes Prout, who had opinions about everything and shared them whether or not she had been consulted. They thought he was sweet on the baker. They thought it was charming, or they thought it was strange, or they thought it was a waste of time because Elara Keene had made it plain she wasn't interested in the attentions of any man. Zane didn't correct them. He didn't have a correction to offer that wasn't worse than the assumption. 6 weeks into his morning vigil, Elara spoke to him for the first time with something other than bare necessity. It was a morning in May, and there was a chill still in the air that the coming heat of the day hadn't yet burned off, and Zane had come to the steps at his usual time and found, unusually, that the light inside the bakery was not yet on. He sat down and waited, and about 20 minutes later he heard something that he recognized after a moment as a person trying very hard not to be heard crying. It came through the wall and the closed door, muffled and faint, but it was unmistakable. The quality of it was what struck him. It was not the loud, releasing kind of grief. It was the tight, controlled kind the kind that happened when you had been holding something for a long time and it escaped you despite your intentions. He didn't know what to do. He sat very still and listened to the silence after the crying stopped, and then he heard her moving around inside, and then the light came on, and after a few more minutes the door opened and she came out to turn the sign. She looked at him. He could see that she had been crying, though she had done her best with the evidence. He didn't say anything about it. "My brother," she said, without preamble, without his having asked. He would have been 24 today. Zane felt the sentence land on him like a physical blow. He kept his face still. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "He died last October." She was looking at the street, not at him. "In Kansas, he was working out there." A pause. "They said he was a thief. He wasn't. He was the most honest person I ever knew." The silence between them was enormous. "I believe you," Zane said. She looked at him then, quickly, as if she hadn't expected that. "Thank you," she said, and went back inside. Zane sat on the steps for a long time after that, and the morning brightened around him, and the town came to life, and he sat there until Chester Vance came out of his store across the street and gave him a questioning look. And then he got up and went to do his job, and he thought about nothing but Thomas Keene for the rest of the day. 3 days later, he wrote a letter to Santa Fe requesting information on the current whereabouts of a cattle broker named Franklin Cree. He told himself it was reflex. He told himself it was his conscience. He told himself a lot of things, and underneath all of them was the fact that he had made an error in Caldwell, a catastrophic moral error, and he was living 500 feet away from the consequence of it, and watching her cry through walls while the sun came up, and he could not continue to do nothing. The response came back 2 weeks later. Franklin Cree had left Caldwell in January of 1883, shortly after the Keene affair, and his current location was listed as Tucson. He had interests in cattle, and according to a note added by the marshal's deputy who responded, possibly in a less savory operation involving the movement of stolen livestock across the territory line. Zane filed this information away and continued to sit on the steps every morning and continued to not tell Elara Keene who he was. He should have told her. He knew he should have told her. Every morning that he sat there and heard her working on the other side of that door and accepted the small grace of her occasional words, he was committing a fresh betrayal layered on top of the old one. He was building something under false pretenses, even if what he was building was only the very fragile, tentative thing that passed between two lonely people who sat on opposite sides of a wall and were too damaged to ask for more. But he didn't know how to begin. He didn't know what sentence contained the right words to say. "I was the law in Caldwell when your brother died, and I knew he was innocent, and I did nothing." There was no right sentence for it. There was only the truth, and the truth was a weapon, and he was afraid. And this was the part that shamed him most of all, not of what it would do to her, but of what it would take from him, because he had come to love the steps. He had come to love the way the dark faded over the red rock mesa to the north, and the way the smell of baking bread was the first thing in the world every morning, and the way Elara's voice sounded when she offered a single spare sentence to the quiet air. He had come to love something after a year of loving nothing, and he was afraid of losing it. He was a coward about it. He would admit this freely. It was the afternoon of a Wednesday in June when the thing that broke everything open arrived in Hatchet Creek. His name was Warren Price. He was a lean man of about 40 with a narrow, weathered face and pale eyes that moved constantly, the eyes of a man who lived by watching exits. He rode in on a black horse and went directly to the Copperhead and ordered whiskey and asked, in a voice just loud enough to be heard by the surrounding tables, whether anyone in Hatchet Creek knew a woman named Elara Keene. Agnes Prout, who was in the Copperhead delivering a telegram to one of the ranchers at that hour, heard this, and Agnes Prout came directly to Zane's office to report it, because Agnes Prout had been born with a talent for recognizing when something was wrong. Zane went to the Copperhead. Warren Price was still there. He looked at Zane's star and seemed unsurprised. He said his name readily and said he was looking for the woman on behalf of a matter of business. He said this in the tone of a man who is saying one thing while meaning another, and Zane, who had been a lawman for 9 years, heard the other thing clearly. "What kind of business?" Zane said. "Personal business between me and the lady," Price said. "Nothing that concerns the law." "In my experience," Zane said, sitting down across from him and folding his hands on the table, "when a man rides into a town he doesn't know and starts asking after a woman the first thing, it often ends up concerning the law. You'll understand if I take an interest." Price looked at him with those pale, restless eyes. "You know her." "I know everyone in this town," Zane said. "That's my job." A silence. Price turned his whiskey glass. "I work for a man named Franklin Cree." The name hit Zane like a brand pressed to bare skin. He didn't move. "Never heard of him," he said. Price smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "He thought you might say that. He also said that if I happened to run into you. And he thought I might, which is an interesting thing to think, isn't it? I should tell you that he knows where you are, and he knows what you're doing, and he finds it real interesting that the sheriff of Caldwell ended up in the same town as Thomas Keene's sister." Every instinct Zane had went cold and precise, the way they always did when the situation became genuinely dangerous. "Why does your employer want with Elara Keene?" he said. "The young lady has been writing letters," Price said, "to lawyers in Topeka, to journalists in Kansas City. She's been working on a case, see, to clear her brother's name. Now, that might not amount to much on its own, but Mr. Cree has some concerns about what she might know and who else she might have talked to. He'd like to have a conversation with her." "No," Zane said. Price raised an eyebrow. "He'd like to have a conversation with her," Zane repeated, "or he'd like to stop her from having conversations with anyone else. Which is it?" Another silence. Price looked at him with something new in his pale eyes, not quite respect, but the recalibration that happened when someone realized they were dealing with more than they had expected. "Mr. Cree would like this matter resolved quietly," Price said. "Get out of my town," Zane said. He said it the way he said all the things that mattered, which was quietly. "Tell your employer that nothing in Hatchet Creek concerns him. And tell him that if he sends anyone else here, I will take a personal interest in his operation in Tucson, which I understand involves some cattle that don't belong to him." Price was very still for a moment. Then he put down his glass and stood and walked out of the Copperhead. Zane sat at the table for another minute. Then he went to find Elara Keene. She was in her bakery, doing the end-of-day cleaning when he knocked on the door. She looked up through the window glass, and her expression went through several things in quick succession before settling on something that was not quite welcome but was not refusal either. She opened the door. "I need to talk to you," he said. "About what?" "About a man named Franklin Cree." The cleaning cloth in her hands went still. The color in her face changed. "You'd better come in," she said. He sat at the small table she used for customers who wanted to eat inside, and she sat across from him, and he told her about Warren Price. He told her all of it, that Price had come looking for her, that Cree had sent him, that Cree knew about her letters and her efforts to clear Thomas's name, that Cree was concerned enough to send an agent. He did not tell her the rest. Not yet. He should have. He should have told her right then, while the door was open and the evening light was coming through the window, and she was looking at him with those careful dark eyes. But she was frightened, He could see the fear under the composure, and he told himself it was not the right moment, that he needed to deal with the immediate threat first, and that was true, but it was also convenient, and he knew it. "He's trying to intimidate you," Zane said. "He's trying to make you stop." "I'm not going to stop," she said. Her chin came up with a steadiness that struck him deep in the chest. "Thomas didn't do it. The evidence is there if someone will look at it. I found the woman who saw Cree's man go into Thomas's room. I found the records showing that the judge in the case was appointed on Cree's recommendation. I have." She stopped, looked at him with those measuring eyes. "Why are you telling me this? Why do you care?" The question was honest and deserved an honest answer, and Zane gave her part of one. "It's my job to protect the people in this town," he said. "And besides that," he paused, "I think your brother deserved better, and I think you deserve to know that someone in Hatchet Creek is paying attention to what happens to you." She looked at him for a long time. "You sit on my steps every morning," she said. "Yes. I used to wonder why. Chester Vance thinks you're smitten with me." A pause. "Agnes Prout thinks you're lonely." "Agnes Prout," Zane said, "is not wrong." Something shifted in her face. Not the brief, surprised smile he had seen occasionally, but something quieter and more complicated. Something that was one part warmth and one part sorrow, as if warmth had become difficult for her and required some grief to accompany it. "I made extra biscuits today," she said. She got up and went behind the counter and came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle and set it on the table between them. "Take them. You look like you haven't been eating properly." He looked at the bundle and then at her. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it a thing," she said, sitting back down. "It's spare biscuits. They'd go to waste otherwise." But she didn't look away when she said it, and neither did he, and they both knew it wasn't really about biscuits. That evening he sat in his office and wrote another letter to Santa Fe. This one was detailed and specific, laying out everything he knew about Franklin Cree's operation and requesting that the marshal's office open a formal investigation. He wrote it with the thoroughness and precision of a man who was done being careful for the wrong reasons. Then he sat for a long time and thought about what he was going to tell Elara. He decided the next morning. He was on the steps before 4 o'clock. The stars were still out and the air was cold with the last of the night, and he sat there with his tin cup and his thoughts, which were not comfortable company. When the light came on inside and he heard her moving around, he let himself be steadied by the sound of it, the specific domesticity of it, the way it made this foreign town feel briefly like a place that contained something real. When she came out to turn the sign, she found him as she always did, and she glanced down at him and said, "You're early," and he said, "I need to tell you something." And she heard the difference in his voice immediately, because she went still, and her hand on the door frame tightened. She came and sat on the step beside him. Not close, there was a foot of space between them, but beside him, which was something new, something that had never happened before. "All right," she said. "Tell me," he told her. He told her everything. He started with Caldwell, and he told it straight through without softening any of it. The accusation, the planted evidence, the trial, his own investigation, what he had found, what Cree had threatened him with, what he had done or rather failed to do, and the morning in October when Thomas Keene had hanged. He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the street and the dark and the slow beginning of dawn on the mesa. When he was done, there was a silence that lasted a very long time. Then she got up and went inside and the door closed, and a few minutes later the Biscuit hit the steps and she was standing over him and she said, "I know who you are." And now they were here, in the middle of what had always been coming, and there was nothing left to hide behind. "You let him hang," she said again. The words were raw with it. "You had the proof and you didn't use it." "Yes," Zane said. "Why are you here?" she demanded. Why are you in my town sitting on my steps every morning? Is it guilt? Is that what this is? It started as guilt, he said. I didn't know you were here when I came. I didn't know you were here when I saw your name above the door, and I nearly rode back out of town that same day. But I didn't. And after that, he stopped. Tried to find the words that were true without being another manipulation. After that it became something else. You became something else, not something I was owed or something that could even things out. Something that he stopped again. She was staring at him. Her fists had unclenched. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm telling you what I should have told you the day I found out who you were, and I'm telling you that Cree has been informed that I am no longer compliant, and I am going to do everything I can to make sure Thomas's name is cleared, regardless of what it costs me. The wind came back. It moved a strand of dark hair across her face and she didn't push it away. Get off my steps, she said. He picked up his tin cup and stood and stepped down to the street and walked away. He did not come back the next morning, or the morning after that. He went about his work. He had Holly's Drummond in his office 3 times that week about the boundary disputes, and he rode out to the Eastern Creek bed twice to talk to the homesteaders about the water rights. And he kept the 2 brothers from the south from breaking anything at the Copperhead by the simple expedient of taking their horses and telling them they could have them back when they were sober. He filed reports. He maintained his correspondence with Santa Fe. He did not go near the bakery. He felt the absence of it like a missing tooth, not a constant pain but a persistent wrongness, a gap in the structure of his days that he kept running up against. On the 4th morning, Agnes Prout came to his office. Agnes Prout was 53 years old and had been running the telegraph office in Hatchet Creek for 11 years and had outlasted 2 husbands and a business partner, and she had the authority that came with that kind of survival. She sat down in the chair across from his desk without being invited and folded her hands on her lap and looked at him. You've stopped going to the bakery, she said. Good morning to you too, Agnes. Don't good morning me, Sheriff. I have a telegraph to run. I don't have time for pleasantries. She looked at him steadily. Elara Keene has not opened her shop the last 2 mornings. Zane looked up. The sign stays closed, Agnes said. I know because I walk past it on my way to the office. She didn't come to Chester's for supplies yesterday. I knocked on her door this morning and she didn't answer, but I could hear her inside. He was standing up before he had consciously decided to stand up. She's not sick, Agnes said, with the flat certainty of a woman who understood things about other women. She's in a bad state. The kind you go into when something has cut too deep. Zane looked at Agnes Prout for a moment, and Agnes Prout looked back at him with eyes that were shrewd and not entirely unsympathetic. You know, he said, it wasn't really a question. I know something happened. I know she's been working on something about her brother for months and something changed. I know you're involved. A pause. Whatever it is, Sheriff, you need to go fix it. That girl opened a bakery in a town she didn't know with nothing but her own hands, and she has not stopped working since the day she arrived. And she has not let herself stop long enough to grieve properly, and she is about to fall apart in that apartment, and there is no one to. Agnes stopped. Composed herself. Just go. He went. He knocked on the door that led from the outside stairs up to her apartment above the bakery. When she didn't answer, he knocked again and said, Elara, I'm not here to argue and I'm not here to make anything worse. I just need to know you're all right. A long silence. Then the sound of the bolt sliding back. She opened the door. She was not in her work clothes. She was in a plain dress with no apron, and her hair was down, and she had clearly not slept, and her eyes were swollen. She looked at him without speaking. Agnes sent me, he said. She's worried about you. Agnes Prout worries about everything. "She's not wrong about this," he paused. "Can I come in?" She looked at him for a moment longer and then stepped back from the door. The apartment was small and neat, the way he would have expected. A bed, a table, a small stove. Curtains on the window that she had made herself, he guessed, from the uneven stitching that was nevertheless careful. On the table there was a photograph in a frame, a young man with a wide, open face and a laugh that came through even in the still image of it. He knew who it was. The knowing of it hit him in the throat. "That's him," he said. "Yes." He stood before the photograph and looked at it, and the grief of it was specific and real, not abstract guilt but grief, which was a different thing. Thomas Keene had been a real person with a face and a laugh and a sister who loved him and had come alone to a desert town and built a life out of nothing because the grief needed a container. "He looks like you," Zane said. "Around the eyes." People said that. A pause. "He was funny. He made you laugh before you realized what he'd said. He would have been someone." Her voice didn't break. It had been broken already and had hardened over. "He would have been someone real." "I know," Zane said. "Don't tell me you know," she said with a sudden heat. "You didn't know him. You had the proof and you put it in a drawer and let him die." "Yes," Zane said, "and I'm going to have to live with that." The heat went out of her voice. She sat down on the edge of her bed and folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the floor, and Zane sat down at the table and did not try to fill the silence. After a while she said, "He used to write me letters. Every month from wherever he was working. He wasn't a great writer. Terrible spelling. But he always told me what he'd seen, what made him laugh, what he was planning to do next. He had plans." A pause. "The last letter I got from him was in September. He said the work was good and the people were decent, and he was thinking about coming back to New Mexico in the spring." The silence after this was unbearable in the best possible way, the way silence becomes when it is full of something too large for words. "What can I do?" Zane said. Not the large question, not the question of redemption. The immediate practical question of a man who needed to do something with his hands. She looked up at him. "Help me finish it," she said. "The case. I have the letters started and I have the evidence I've gathered, but I don't know the law the way you do. I don't know who to send it to or how to make it stick." "All right," he said. "I mean it. I don't want," she stopped. "I don't want this to be something you do because you feel bad. I want it done properly. I want his name cleared and I want the record corrected and I want people to know what Franklin Cree did." "So do I," Zane said, "and not just because I feel bad." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why then?" He considered the question with the care it deserved. "Because Thomas Keene was an innocent man and the law failed him, and the law is the only thing I have to offer this world. If I can't make it right when it fails, then I have nothing." She was quiet. And then, slowly, like a thing returning from a long distance, she said, "You may as well come downstairs. I haven't opened the shop in 2 days and I have a batch in the oven that'll go to waste if I don't tend to it." He followed her downstairs. They worked side by side for 2 hours, which was to say she worked, and he sat at the customer table and ate biscuits and watched, and sometimes she talked, and sometimes she didn't. She told him more about Thomas, about their childhood, about their parents who had both died young, about the way Thomas had been the only family she had for a long time, about how she had found out about his death, arriving via telegram at the general store, handed to her by Chester Vance with his face doing something uncomfortable because he hadn't known what to say. Zane listened. He was a good listener, which was part of what made him a good lawman, but listening to Elara Keene was different from professional listening. It required something of him that was not technique, but something more personal, a willingness to let her pain be real to him rather than information to be processed. He came back that evening with his files from the Caldwell case, the ones he had kept, the ones that contained his original investigation and the notes from his interview with the witness Dolores. He had carried those files from Caldwell to Santa Fe to Hatchet Creek without quite knowing why he couldn't abandon them. And now he spread them on her table and she sat across from him, and they went through them together. She was sharp. Sharper than he expected, though he wasn't sure why he should have expected otherwise. She had been conducting her own investigation for months and had gotten further than most people would have. She asked precise questions and identified exactly the points where his evidence connected to what she had gathered, and within 2 hours they had constructed an argument that was better than either of them had had separately. "We need to send this to the Kansas Attorney General," Zane said. "Not just the marshal's office. This is a case of judicial corruption and that requires the AG's attention." "Will they listen?" "They'll listen if it comes from a sitting sheriff." He paused. "And if there's a journalist involved, someone from Kansas City who can make noise if the AG is slow." "I have a contact at the Kansas City Journal," she said. "A woman named Frances Holden who has been writing about corruption in the cattle industry. I wrote to her 3 months ago, but I didn't have enough then." "You have enough now," Zane said. She looked at the papers spread between them and then at him, and for the first time since he had told her the truth, she looked at him without the wall of it between them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me, it's the least I owe." "Maybe," she said. "But you're here, and you're helping, and that's—" She stopped. "That's something." They sent the letters the next morning, using the telegraph office for the urgent portions and the post for the detailed documentation. Agnes Prout took in the telegrams with her usual brisk efficiency and did not ask any questions, though her eyes moved over both of them with satisfaction. Life returned to its shape in some ways but not in others. Zane went back to sitting on the steps. He had not assumed he would, but on the first morning after they had sent the letters he found himself there before he had made any conscious decision about it. And when Elara came out to turn the sign, she looked down at him and said, "There's fresh coffee if you want some," and went back inside without waiting for an answer. He went inside for the first time. The bakery in the morning, before it opened, was a different place than the bakery from the outside. It was warm and close and full of smells that layered on top of each other in a way that was almost dizzying. Bread, spices, the wood smoke from the oven, something sweet. Elara moved through it with the ease of long practice, knowing every inch of the space, and she poured him coffee from a tin pot on the warming shelf and handed it to him without ceremony. "Better than what you make in your office," she said. He tasted it. "Considerably." A small silence. She went back to what she had been doing, which was shaping biscuit dough, and he leaned against the counter and drank the good coffee and watched her hands work. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "What are you doing here, in Hatchet Creek?" "Not the governor's appointment, I know that part. I mean, why did you take it? You could have refused." "I needed to be somewhere," he said. "And I needed it to matter." "Does it," she asked, "matter?" He thought about the homesteaders and the water rights, the disputes he'd mediated, the 2 brothers he'd kept from serious trouble, the way the town had settled slightly in the months since he'd arrived, the specific incremental changes that most people never noticed, but that a lawman felt in his bones. "Yes," he said. "It matters." "Good," she said, and shaped another biscuit. This became their morning from that point forward. He came inside. She made coffee. He sat at the counter or at the table and she worked, and they talked or didn't. And when the bakery opened at 5, he moved to his customary spot on the steps outside. But now the steps were the outside of a place he had been inside, which was a different thing entirely. The response from the Kansas Attorney General's office arrived 5 weeks later, brought by a rider from the telegraph station in the county seat. It was addressed to Zane as the law officer of record, but he brought it directly to Elara, unopened. She opened it. The AG's office was opening an investigation into the conduct of Judge Avery Nichols in the matter of the state of Kansas v. Thomas Keene. Franklin Cree was named as a person of interest. The investigation was to be conducted in cooperation with the U.S. Marshal's office, given the interstate dimensions of the matter. There was also a note, handwritten, which Zane had not expected, from the AG himself, a man named Claude Whitmore, who said that he had been made aware of this matter by Miss Frances Holden of the Kansas City Journal, whose piece on the subject had run in the paper 3 days prior, and that the evidence submitted was compelling. Elara read the letter twice, folded it, unfolded it, and read it a third time. Then she set it very carefully on the counter and stood with both hands flat on the wood and breathed. Zane stood across the counter and let her have the moment. "It's not done," she said. "No. It's the beginning of done. They might still decide it wasn't enough. They might clear the judge. They might decide Cree had too much, Elara." He waited until she looked at him. "They have the testimony of a witness who saw Cree's man in your brother's room. They have the record of judicial appointments. They have my original investigation notes, which I kept and which I should have submitted at the time. And they have Frances Holden writing about it in Kansas City, which means anyone who decides to suppress it does so in public." He paused. "It's going to hold." She looked at him for a long moment, and then her face did something that was not quite the brief, surprised smile he had come to know. It was longer than that, and softer, and it carried something different in it. "I'm glad you sat on my steps," she said. The summer settled into the rhythm of progress and patience, which were the two things every difficult endeavor required. They heard from the marshal's office twice through June, routine requests for additional documentation, which Zane provided. Frances Holden's piece in the Kansas City Journal was picked up and reprinted in papers in Topeka and Denver, and once, spectacularly, in a New York newspaper, which sent the whole matter into a different register of public attention. Franklin Cree's attorney wrote a letter to the AG's office claiming that the entire matter was a fabrication by a grieving sister and a disgraced former lawman, which Zane found irritating and Elara found almost amusing. "Disgraced," she said, sitting at the table in her bakery late one afternoon when the shop was closed and they were going through the latest correspondence. "Is that what you are?" "It's what I was," he said. "Whether I still am is an ongoing question." She looked at him over the papers. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're disgraced. I think you made a terrible choice and you've been paying for it every day since. The payment doesn't cancel the debt." "No," she agreed, "but it changes who you are now versus who you were then." A pause. Thomas would have said that. He sounds like he was a wise person. He was 23 and full of nonsense, mostly. The smile came, real and lasting, warm with memory. But sometimes he said something that stopped you cold. He watched her with the smile, and thought that whatever happened with the case, and with Cree and with all of it, he wanted to keep hearing her talk about Thomas. Not because he owed it to Thomas's memory, though he did, but because it was the way she came most alive, in the remembering of someone she had loved. The thought that followed this was one he had been edging around for weeks. It arrived now and settled in him with the quiet certainty of a thing that had always been true. He had fallen in love with her. He acknowledged this to himself the way he acknowledged all difficult truths, squarely, with full attention, without looking for a way out of it. He was in love with Elara Keene, and she was the person most entitled to never want anything to do with him, and he was not going to say anything about it because it was not the right time, and it might never be the right time, and that was something he was going to have to learn to live with. He didn't say anything about it, but he was less careful after that private acknowledgement about what he let his face show. And Elara Keene was observant. She had always been observant, and she began to look at him sometimes with an expression that he couldn't quite parse, something thoughtful and examining that was new. July brought heat that pressed down on Hatchet Creek like a hand, and the water rights dispute along the eastern creek bed reached a critical point when one of the three families diverted the flow in a way that cut off the other two. Zane spent 3 days mediating, which was to say arguing, persuading, making promises about what the law would and would not support, threatening consequences he would carry out if he had to, and finally brokering an arrangement that no one was entirely happy with but everyone could live with. When he got back to town on the third evening, road dusted and aching and not entirely certain he hadn't made it worse before he'd made it better, Elara was sitting on her own steps. This was so unusual that he stopped in the street and looked at her. She was sitting exactly the way he sat, both hands around a cup, looking at the middle distance, not particularly at anything. She looked up when he stopped. "Hard few days," she said. "Creek bed situation," he said. "3 families, 1 creek, no easy answers. Did you solve it? For now." She nodded, and then she said, "Sit down, I have something to tell you." He sat down on the steps beside her, close this time, the same step, not a foot of space between them. "I got a letter today," she said, "from Claude Whitmore." He was very still. "The investigation has reached a conclusion," she said. "Formally, Judge Nichols is being removed from the bench and referred for criminal prosecution. Franklin Cree has been indicted on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice, false imprisonment, and," her voice did something complicated, "and causing wrongful death. The formal record will be corrected. Thomas's conviction is being vacated." The silence that followed was immense and needed to be. "Elara," Zane said. "He's been dead for 9 months," she said. The steadiness in her voice was the hardest kind, the kind that had been built over grief and was still covering it. "Vacating the conviction doesn't," she stopped. "I know," he said. "It doesn't bring him back. I know. But it's true," she said. "That's what matters. That everyone knows it's true. That there's a record somewhere that says Thomas Keene didn't do it." She looked at him. Her eyes were bright with tears that she was not going to shed right now, not in the middle of Main Street. "You helped me do that. You did that," he said. "You started it. You kept it going. You found the witness and you wrote the letters and you didn't stop. I just had the legal knowledge you needed. Don't diminish what you did. I'm not. I'm telling you what was yours." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her expression was everything, the grief and the relief and something that was new to him on her face, something that was opening like a door. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right. I was furious at you. I still am, in some part of me that probably always will be." She was choosing the words with care. "But I have also come to know you these past months, and you are not. You are not only what you did in Caldwell. You're a man who made a devastating choice and has been trying to be better than it ever since." A pause. "I'm not forgiving the choice. I don't think forgiveness is the right word, but I'm not holding you to only that." He sat with this. "Let it be what it was. Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, which was what he had said to her when she'd thanked him. She almost smiled. "Elara," he said. "What?" He looked at her. The evening light was long and golden on the mesa behind her, and she had flour in her hair, which she always did. And she was looking at him with those careful dark eyes that were careful in a different way now than they had been at the beginning. Not closed, but open and cautious, ready to look at what they found. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you'd allow it." She looked at him for what felt like a very long time. "You've been sitting on my steps for 4 months," she said. "That wasn't calling on you, that was—" He stopped. "That was me needing somewhere to be. And this would be different, yes." "How?" "Because I would be there because of you, not because of what I need, because of who you are and what I feel about it." The evening was very quiet. A horse shifted in the livery. Somewhere someone was cooking meat over fire, and the smell came down the street on the warm air. "Come to dinner on Friday," she said. "I'll cook." "You cook all day." "I bake all day. That's different. I cook at night." A pause. "Come at 6. "All right," he said. She got up and went inside with her cup, and the door closed, and Zane sat on her steps for a little while longer, and the evening turned toward night around him. And he thought about nothing very much except that the world contained this, whatever this was, and that was something he had not been certain of for a long time. Friday came, and he knocked on her door at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hand, and his hair combed, and his boots cleaned, which was as close to formal as a man in Hatchet Creek could get. She had made a proper dinner. Beef stew with dried peppers, and something she had done with the cornbread that made it taste different from any cornbread he had eaten before, richer and darker. She had put a cloth on the small table, which was not something the table usually had, and there was a candle, which gave the room a warmth that it didn't have in the daytime. They talked for 3 hours. He had not talked like this with another person for a long time. He told her about Kansas, about Dodge City, about what he had thought he was building in those early years of his career, when he had still believed entirely in the law as a mechanism of justice, rather than power. She told him about growing up in New Mexico territory, about her parents' ranch, about the year after their deaths when she and Thomas had been 18 and 21 and had had to figure out what came next. "I always wanted to bake," she said. "My mother taught me. I used to make bread when I was 6 years old, just to make it. Not because we needed it, she made plenty, but because I liked the process, the way it came together from nothing. And your brother," Thomas wanted to see things. He'd read everything he could find about the West, the real West, the territories, what was out there. He wasn't reckless about it. He was, she smiled. He was methodical about his adventuring. He made lists. He had a list of every territory he wanted to work in. Kansas was number 3. What were 1 and 2? Colorado and Nevada. He did both. A pause. He was good at working, took after our father that way. "Did he know you'd ended up here?" "I wrote to him when I got the bakery running. He wrote back and said it sounded like the finest place in New Mexico territory, and he was going to come see it as soon as he could." She looked at the candle. "He never got to." Zane reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a simple thing and a significant thing, and she looked down at it and then up at him and did not pull away. "He would have liked this town," he said. "Small as it is." He liked small towns, she agreed. He said the big cities were too busy being impressive to be real. They sat like that for a moment, his hand over hers on the cloth-covered table, the candle burning between them. "I like this town," Zane said, "more than I expected to." "Why?" He considered it. "It's honest," he said. "The problems are the size you can see them. The creek bed and the boundary lines and the 2 brothers who break things once a month. Small enough to manage, real enough to matter." "Are you staying?" she asked. "I'd like to." She looked at him directly, the way she did when she was asking something important under the surface of the words. "Even after all of this is settled," she said. "Even after Cree is prosecuted and Thomas's name is cleared and you've done what you came to do." "I didn't come here to do any of that," he said. "I came here because the governor gave me a job and I needed a job. What I've done here," he paused. "What I've done here matters to me for its own reasons, not as penance, because this is where I am and these are the people I'm responsible for." A pause. "And because you're here." The last sentence landed and sat between them, and she did not look away. "I'm not easy," she said. "I don't trust quickly, and I don't." She stopped. "I've been alone for a long time by choice. I'm not sure I know how to be otherwise." "I'm not in any hurry," he said. "You've been sitting on my steps every morning for 4 months. And it was the best part of my day," he said simply. She looked at him, and her face was doing the complicated thing again, the thing that was opening, and she said, "Stay for dessert. I made a pie." He stayed. He stayed until well past 9, which in Hatchet Creek was considerably after dark, and when he left he stood on the lower step, and she stood in the doorway above him, and they looked at each other for a moment. "Saturday morning," she said. "If you're on the steps, there'll be biscuits." "I'll be on the steps," he said. August was slow and hot and full of small developments. The investigation in Kansas moved through its formal phases, and Zane received regular updates from the marshal's office in Santa Fe. Cree's legal team was formidable, but the evidence was more so. And by the end of the month, it was clear that the prosecution would go forward. Judge Nichols resigned rather than face the removal proceedings, which was a less satisfying outcome but a real one. He called on Elara every Friday evening, and he sat on her steps every morning, and she brought him coffee and sometimes biscuits, and they talked through the door and through the window and across the customer table, and at her small dinner table upstairs. And something grew between them that was the particular and irreplaceable thing that grew only between two people who had decided to be honest with each other, and had found that the honesty was survivable. In October, on the first anniversary of Thomas's death, which they both knew without acknowledging it for the first 3 hours of the morning, she found him on the steps, and instead of going back inside, she sat down beside him, and they watched the sun come up over the mesa together in silence. After a while he said he should be here. "Yes," she said, "he should." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of Thomas Keene, of who he had been and what his life had deserved to contain, and of the specific injustice that had ended it, and of the fact that the injustice was being answered even if it could never be undone. Elara leaned her head against Zane's shoulder, just slightly. Just barely. He did not move. He let her have it. They stayed that way until the sun was fully up and the bakery needed opening. Franklin Cree's trial began in Topeka in November and lasted 11 days. Zane was not required to testify in person. His written testimony and the documented evidence were considered sufficient. But he followed the proceedings through the mail and the occasional telegram from Agnes Prout, who had somehow acquired a correspondent in Topeka and received daily updates. On the 12th day, Agnes walked into his office with a telegram in her hand and a look on her face that was as close to satisfied as Agnes Prout ever got. "Guilty," she said. "On all counts." Zane sat back in his chair and breathed. "Cree," he said, "Cree. 12 years in federal prison." She paused. "Also a note from the AG's office addressed to you, saying your cooperation was instrumental and that your original investigation work was, and I'm quoting, a model of thoroughness and professional integrity." He thought about that. He thought about what it meant and what it didn't mean and what it would never be able to undo. "Thank you, Agnes," he said. "I already told Elara," Agnes said. "I thought she ought to know first." "You did right," he said. Agnes gave him a look that contained several years' worth of opinions about him and Elara Keene and what they were doing about it. "Well," she said, and left. Zane went to the bakery. Elara was behind the counter. The shop was nearly empty in the late morning. She always sold out early, and when he came through the door she looked up, and he could see that Agnes had been there, because her eyes were bright. He went to the counter and she came around it and she stood in front of him and she said, "It's done." "It's done," he said. She put her arms around him. It was the first time she had done so, and it was not a tentative thing or a small thing. It was a real embrace, the full weight of her leaning into him, her face against the front of his coat, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her while she breathed. She was crying. Not the tight, controlled kind this time. The releasing kind, the kind that happened when the thing you had been holding finally had somewhere to go. He held her for a long time. When she pulled back, her face was a mess and she didn't seem to care, which was something Zane found beautiful in a way that surprised him. He was innocent, she said, and now everyone knows it. Everyone knows it, he confirmed. She looked up at him, this close, his arms still around her in the quiet of the bakery with the morning light coming through the windows and the smell of everything she had made filling the air. "Zane," she said. "Elara. I think I'm in love with you," she said. "I've been trying to determine that for some time." He looked at her and felt the truth of it land in him in a way that was completely different from when he had acknowledged it to himself. When it was his own private knowing, it had been something he carried quietly. When she said it, it was something else. It was the world shifting into a shape that was better than before. "I have been quite certainly in love with you," he said, "since at least May." She made a sound that was half a laugh and half something more vulnerable. "Since May," she repeated. "You didn't say anything. It didn't seem like my right. And now you've said it first," he said, "so my rights feel somewhat adjusted." She laughed then, a real laugh, full and surprised, the kind she gave when something caught her off guard. And then she kissed him, which was not tentative at all. December brought cold to Hatchet Creek, the kind that came off the high desert at night and made the stars look hard and bright. Zane moved his morning coffee inside on the really cold mornings, sitting at the counter while Elara worked, which Agnes Prout noted to Chester Vance with a satisfaction she made no effort to conceal. Christmas was a small affair in Hatchet Creek, but Elara made it larger than usual, which was to say she baked for 3 days straight, and the whole town smelled of cinnamon and dried fruit. And she invited half a dozen people she barely knew to share the results, because grief had taught her that isolation was a choice you could unmake. Agnes Prout came. Chester Vance came with his wife Mildred. A young Mexican family named Reyes who lived on the edge of town, and who Elara had quietly given bread to on several cold mornings when their situation had looked difficult, came, with their 3 small children who ate biscuits with the concentration of people encountering something remarkable. Zane came, and when he arrived he stood in the doorway of the bakery, which Elara had strung with greenery from the hills, dried holly berries and the dark green of the juniper that grew along the creek, and looked at the room full of people and candles, and the smell of everything she had made, and thought about a man sitting alone on these steps in the cold of January, not knowing what any of it was going to become. Elara came and stood beside him in the doorway, holding 2 cups. "You're blocking the entrance," she said. "I'm appreciating it," he said. She handed him a cup and looked at the room with him. "It's a good thing," she said, "isn't it?" "Yes," he said, "it's a very good thing." In the spring of 1884, Zane asked Elara to marry him. He did it on the steps of the bakery in the early morning, before the sun came up, which seemed like the right place for something that had begun there. He had a ring that he had ordered through Chester Vance from a jeweler in Santa Fe, a simple gold band with a small green stone, which he had chosen because she sometimes wore green and it suited her. She was sitting beside him when he did it, both of them with their cups, watching the sky change over the mesa, and he said, "I want to ask you something," and she said, "All right," and he said the words. She was quiet for long enough that he felt the edge of the particular uncertainty that attended any moment of complete honesty between 2 people. Then she said, "Yes." She said it simply and with conviction, without hesitation or qualification. And when he put the ring on her finger, she looked at it in the early light and then at him, and she said, "I want to get married here. Right here in Hatchet Creek." "We'll get married right here in Hatchet Creek," he said. They married in June, in the small church, with the whole of Hatchet Creek in attendance, which was to say roughly 350 people pressed into a building designed for half that number, with the overflow standing at the open windows and doors. Agnes Prout cried, which she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. Chester Vance said afterward that it was the best wedding he had attended in 40 years, which was high praise from Chester Vance. Elara wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue flowers at the collar, and she carried juniper, and when she came down the aisle of the crowded little church, she looked at Zane the way she looked at things she had decided to trust completely, which was with total attention and no reservation. He thought about all of it in the moments before she reached him. Caldwell and Thomas and the steps and the biscuits. And the 4 months of watching a light in a window and believing it meant something, and it had meant something. It had meant this. It had meant her walking toward him in a white dress with her chin up and those careful dark eyes open and sure. She reached him and they stood facing each other, and the preacher spoke, and outside the wind came off the mesa and moved through the open windows with the smell of the high desert, and somewhere in the back of the church, one of the Ray's children dropped something that made a noise and everyone laughed, and it was real and imperfect and completely right. That autumn, they moved Elara's things from the apartment above the bakery into the small house that sat 3 buildings down from the sheriff's office, which Zane had rented with the intention of buying, and which they now arranged together, fitting their different possessions into the rooms. Thomas's photograph was given a place on the mantel of the fireplace. Zane thought this was right and said so. Elara said nothing for a moment and then kissed him on the cheek. Elara kept the bakery. This had never been in question. She opened it at 4 in the morning, as she always had, and closed at noon. And in the afternoon she was home. And if people in Hatchet Creek thought it was unusual for the sheriff's wife to keep her own business, they were in Hatchet Creek in 1884, and there was already enough unusual about the situation that the bakery was the least of it. Zane continued to sit on the steps every morning with his cup, though now the cup was better coffee, because Elara had taken charge of the procurement and the making of it. He sat for somewhat less time than before, because there was a bed to return to and a reason to return to it, but he sat, because the morning steps had been the beginning of everything, and he saw no reason to give them up. In the spring of 1885, their son was born. They named him Thomas, which was Elara's idea, and Zane agreed without a second's hesitation. Thomas Jarrett had his mother's eyes and his father's chin, and a disposition that was, from the beginning, so settled and good-humored that people who met him assumed he was older than he was. Elara, holding him in the morning light of the room they had made together, looked up at Zane standing over her and said, "He should know." "He will," Zane said. "All of it. Who he's named for and why." She looked at him, and her face was doing the complicated thing again, but in a new register, one he didn't have a name for yet. Something to do with the fullness of the present moment against the weight of everything that had preceded it. "We should tell Agnes first," Elara said. "She'll be insufferable if she finds out from anyone else." "She's going to be insufferable regardless," Zane said. "True," Elara said, "but let's give her the satisfaction." Agnes Prout, when told, did not cry. She came to the house and looked at the baby with the expression of a woman who had been right about something important and was choosing not to say so, and she held him for approximately 90 seconds and then handed him back and said, "He looks like Elara." "Good." Chester Vance brought a commemorative gift, which was a jar of hard candies that no one asked about, and the Ray's family brought food, which was considerably more welcome. The town of Hatchet Creek arranged itself around this new fact as it arranged itself around all new facts, gradually, unself-consciously, until it was simply part of the landscape. Life in the territory continued to change as it always was. The railroad was coming closer, which would change everything. The rhythms of trade, the flow of people, the character of the place. There were those in Hatchet Creek who worried about it, and those who welcomed it. And Zane listened to both sides and tried to keep the peace, which was still his primary occupation. The boundary disputes continued in new forms. Holly's Drummond finally pushed too far, and Zane had him in court before the circuit judge, which resulted in an order that settled the contested lines for the foreseeable future. The Ray's family expanded their small operation into a proper garden that supplied half the town with vegetables by summer. Agnes Prout replaced her telegraph equipment and could now receive messages that were actually legible, which she considered one of the major improvements of the decade. Elara expanded the bakery. She had the wall between her original space and the adjacent empty building taken down, and hired a young woman named Clara Sims, who had come to Hatchet Creek with her family from Texas, and who had never baked anything in her life, but who learned with an intensity and quickness that Elara said reminded her of herself. Clara turned out to have a talent specifically for the decorative work, the shaped pastries, the detailed biscuit cutouts, that Elara did not entirely share. And within 6 months, Clara's work was bringing people into the bakery specifically to see what she had made, which was a fine development all around. On a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1886, when Thomas was just over a year old and walking with the determined imprecision of a person who had recently discovered legs, Zane was sitting on the bakery steps in the early morning as he had sat there for 3 years. He had his coffee. The sky was doing its slow transformation from black to gray to the first pale blue, and the mesa to the north was beginning to catch the light. The door opened and Elara came out, not to turn the sign. The sign didn't need turning yet, but to sit beside him with her own cup, the way she had started doing on mornings when she had the time. Thomas said a new word, she said. What word? Door, she said. He walked up to the bakery door and pointed at it and said door. That's appropriate, Zane said, given his relationship with this door. She settled beside him, her shoulder against his. The sky continued to change. There's something I want to tell you, she said. He looked at her. We're going to have another one, she said. He was quiet for a moment, feeling the news settle into him with the particular joy that was also a kind of gravity, the weight of something real. When? He said. Harriet says December. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and they looked at the mesa and the lightening sky together. A name, he said. I was thinking your father's name, she said, if it's a boy. Zane's father had been a man named Samuel, who had worked a small farm in Missouri and had died when Zane was 17, and about whom Zane had not spoken in a long time because the speaking of it required the kind of openness he had not been capable of for many years. Elara had asked him, one night, over dinner, to tell her about his family, and he had told her about Samuel Jarrett, who had worked from before dawn until after dark, and had never complained about any of it, and had taught Zane the 2 things Zane considered most important: that the law existed to protect the people who had no other protection, and that the work of your hands was the one thing no one could take from you. Samuel, he said, yes, that's right. And if it's a girl, she said, I was thinking Dolores. He looked at her. The woman in Caldwell, she said quietly. Who told you the truth? She's part of this story too. He sat with this for a moment, with the specific weight of it that she had thought about that woman, had thought about all the small nodes of consequence that had led them here and wanted to honor them. "Dolores," he said. "Yes." She was quiet. The sky was fully light now, and the first sounds of the town beginning its day were coming from various directions. "I was afraid," she said suddenly. "When you first told me about Caldwell, I was so angry, but underneath it I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you were someone I couldn't trust," she said. "That I had been making a mistake all those mornings, letting things shift." She paused. "I had been so careful after Thomas. I hadn't let anything in for so long." "I know," he said. "But you told me," she said. "You didn't have to. I didn't know, and you could have let it stay that way, but you told me because it was true and it was right, and because you couldn't be the person you wanted to be and keep that secret." She turned her head to look at him. "That's why I trust you, not despite Caldwell. Because of how you handled it afterward." He looked back at her and thought about all the ways this could have gone differently. About the morning in October when he had come to this town not knowing she was in it. About the flower boxes in the window and the name above the door and the choice to stay. "I sat on your steps," he said. "Every morning," she said. "And you brought me biscuits, spare biscuits. They were going to waste. They were not going to waste, and you know it." She had the brief, surprised smile, the one that had started returning and had now become simply her smile, the one she wore most of the time, the one that made the whole of Hatchet Creek a different place than it had been before her. "No," she said. "They were not going to waste." He kissed her on the temple, and she settled more comfortably against him. And the morning opened around them, full of everything it contained. The town and the mesa and the dry, fragrant air, and the sound of one small boy, somewhere inside beginning to make the specific sounds of a person who has recently woken up and is not planning to wait long for breakfast. The bakery would open in an hour. The step was wooden and worn from 3 years of morning use. The coffee was good. The sky over the mesa was the color of something that had no name but was perfect nonetheless. Elara finished her coffee and stood up and brushed the dust from her skirt with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had biscuits to make and a world to feed. She reached out her hand. He took it and stood and followed her inside. December came as it had promised and brought with it a daughter, whom they named Dolores. And she arrived in the world with a clarity and directness that the midwife Harriet said she had rarely seen, as if the child had taken one look at the room and decided she understood it perfectly well and had no complaints. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and very clear about his own importance, studied his sister for 3 full minutes and then pointed at her and said her name, which he mispronounced in a way that made Elara laugh for the first time in 2 days. The 4 of them filled the small house on the street 3 buildings down from the sheriff's office, and the house held them as houses held families. Not always comfortably, not without friction, but with the specific warmth of a place that contained people who had chosen each other. Elara baked. Clara Sims ran more of the bakery than she had a year before, which gave Elara afternoons and occasionally mornings that were her own in a new way, and she used them for the children. And for letters, she wrote to Francis Holden in Kansas City, who had become a genuine correspondent, and who was working on a larger piece about judicial corruption in the territories. Zane kept the peace in Hatchet Creek, which required, as it always had, more patience than force. He mediated and persuaded and occasionally threatened and rarely, but sometimes acted, and the town was, by most measures, as well governed as any small town in New Mexico Territory in the late 1880s. He sat on the steps every morning. He would do so for the rest of his life in Hatchet Creek, which would be a long life and a good one. The steps were worn to a shine by the time his children were old enough to notice, And Thomas and Dolores both asked, at various points in their childhoods, why their father sat outside the bakery every morning, and he told them both the same thing, that it was where he had learned that something was worth staying for. Thomas, when he was 8, sat beside his father on the steps one morning and said, "Did you love her from the beginning?" Zane considered the question as he considered all honest questions, which was with full attention. "Not from the beginning," he said. "From somewhere in the middle, which is when it tends to happen." Thomas thought about this and said, "That seems right," with the gravity of a person who has just discovered that the world makes a kind of sense. Elara, who had heard this from the other side of the door, came out with biscuits, not spare biscuits. Biscuits that had been made with care and intention, and brought out because the people on the steps were the center of everything she had built. And they deserved the best biscuits she knew how to make, which were very good indeed. She sat down on the step on the other side of their son, and the three of them sat in the early morning with the mesa turning gold behind them, and the town of Hatchet Creek beginning its day all around, and the warmth of the bakery behind them, and the wide, real sky above them, and everything between them accounted for, every debt acknowledged and every truth told, and every grief given its proper place, and the biscuits were warm in the morning air. This was the shape of it. This was what had grown from a lonely man on cold steps, and a woman with flour on her hands who had brought him something spare, not knowing it was the beginning of everything, not knowing the man on her steps carried her brother's story in his chest, and was trying to figure out how to live with it, not knowing that what she handed him that morning was not just bread, but the first thread of something that would hold them both. They stayed on the steps until the sun was fully up and the bakery needed opening, and the town needed its sheriff, and the children needed their breakfast. And then they all went inside together, into the warmth and the light and the smell of everything that had been made, and the door closed behind them.